take care of our arterial roadways, basically coming off 95, 6th Avenue South, 10th Avenue North. This is that cost. When you're looking at the total there, that $535,000, that's going to get 15 blocks done. Now, this is only, as I mentioned, as arterial roadways. This is not in the neighborhoods. So if it was something where we were looking at, well, what if we want to do more than that? What if we want to do 30? What if we only do 45? At least we have this base number, and we know what to multiply by. Now, moving beyond this, if this 2020 plan is going to truly be a comprehensive plan, there are other elements in the city and other components that really need to be addressed. Which brings us to the next slide. Our city buildings. Now, personally, this is one that hits home for me. I'm over at the PSTP, or the Public Service Trailer Park. As we have named it.
Affectionately known as.
And all of you were in the city garage prior to the raft race this year to build the city raft, which next year will win. Herman. You've seen the conditions over there. When we get a lot of rain, the roof is so terrible. The guys have to actually stop working because of all the rain that's falling from the ceiling. So we've got a lot of issues with buildings, and the city manager was actually going to come up because last year he had spoken about a citywide facilities master plan, because we have a lot of functions that are just kind of not operating out of where they really need to be operating out of.
Thank you, JB. Yes, as he said, we had a discussion, a presentation about the issue of our assets that we own and how we need to engage them differently so that they're actually providing economic opportunity and functioning better. So the buildings is listed there apart from the city services complex, which would be it wouldn't be a public access facility. That's for the workers of all second behind 1900. We've had conversations with you about 1000 Lake, which is owned by the CRA right across the way here. It's currently empty. It's got beautiful artwork in it, but it's not contributing. And I put one-stop shop there. The concept that we've always talked about as well is you should be able to go to one spot in the city if you need to talk to code enforcement, if you need to buy a decal, if you want to pay your utility bill. And it's not only convenient for the customers, the owners, it's also financially responsible because they can cross-train the staff in those facilities where we have cashier needs. There's a lot of things behind the scenes. Instead of having those duplicated in several areas like we do now, there's a lot of efficiency to group them into one place and have a one-stop shop. And in other cities, the traffic flow is a lot better, the service is a lot higher because you've got this ability to go between different places. So that's the concept there. As part of that too, we would consider moving finance out of this building, which Mr. Carr is very upset about. And that leads us to the next item there. We say the original auditorium. The history of this building is it's not a city hall. It wasn't built as a city hall. It is an auditorium. It says so when you go outside, look back up at the top of the arch. And it's a good argument to say that if there was some way to get grant funding or naming rights or whatever and reactivate this as a center where you could have the flower show, the art show, some activities, dances. This is so centrally located, plus it's on this side of Dixie Highway to push and back up what we're doing in the Arts District. Which, if we do the one-stop shop above that, the question then becomes the City Hall Annex building. That is a premier location on the Cultural Plaza that, we want to provide activities and functions and things there that would draw foot traffic to the downtown core, which really isn't being done right now with having utility payment. Those folks come and pay generally and leave. And then, of course, our beloved old health department building, the North F Street building. So we ballparked some figures in there. Again, we'd like to get these a little more accurate as we go forward. But for the purposes of this discussion, we put $1 million, $1.5 million. So our total for all the city facility needs at this point, we're estimating around $10 million. Quick. You would give me a piece of equipment here. Look at that. And then the other piece that we thought we would give you the option, and again, these are all options we're throwing out there for discussion purposes. It's not unreasonable to expect that the city would want to acquire properties. We talked talked about the need for some extra space here and there, such as parking. You know, I had some conversations with you about the land that's behind the post office, for example, and the need for those types of parking needs downtown. And then there's some other facilities around the city that you may want to contemplate. This gives us the ability to start into negotiations and talk about that in a meaningful way. Again, it's an option. It's not, maybe you might not think of it in the same category as the rest of this, and that's why we're laying it out that way. So those were the two categories we have there. The next part is the financing, and did you want to say something?
Actually, no, I can proceed. I was actually going to, but I did forget to mention when I was talking about some of the enhancements, like the landscaping, things like that. You know, we, I guess I can officially talk about it now. We actually put in this year and we're awarded, we're going to be a Tree City USA, which is a big thing. And with that, we were awarded a grant. So we're actually going to do a citywide tree survey. So we're going to actually have everything. Yeah.
She's not falling for it. The tree.
That was the last meeting.
Oh, we can say tree now?
You can say tree now, today's fine.
But I
Just that last time.
I did want to mention that when we were going through all the different plans and looking at all the different maps, every single, our unimproved right-of-ways, we're calling them right now, in the alleyways that are basically running east-west, every single one of those is not going to necessarily be paved. You know, we're looking at doing greenways in a lot of these, depending on where it makes sense. We'll obviously get neighborhood input when we're looking to do those, but, you know, right now we have an engineering firm, Keith Showers off our CCNA list, doing a citywide greenway plan for us, basically. So when we're going for the CDBG funds and everything, we have that base plan that says block by block, no matter where you are in the city, it's going to look somewhat similar, instead of right now where they're all kind of different. Whether that's a meandering pathway down the center, tree, alternating, sod, benches, everything's gonna be the same, so we'll have that, finally, that standard, that city standard for greenways. But I just wanted to throw that out there, so when people are looking at the maps, they're not thinking that every single east-west street that's not currently paved is going to be paved, because that's not accurate. Now Steve Carr is the city's finance director. He's gonna come up and kind of go through the different versions of the different plans and talk about the financing options and everything else. Steve?
Thank you.
Thanks, Jamie. Go ahead. Well, this is easy to read. Who you are, but, and hopefully everybody has a hard copy.
Does anyone need a copy?
Hard copy, to see what we're talking about here, because we're gonna use this exact same format to look at the cost and financing for all 5 of the programs ultimately of this plan that we're talking about today. And as Mike said and Jamie said, obviously depending on what you choose to do or not do or amend and so on, we'll all change this. This is just as it sits now to give you an idea. So this first sheet here talks about what we call the base plan, which in this case, the base plan is the streets that are 55, have a PCI of 55 and below. And
Again, 55 for people just joining us is no roadways at all to probably the worst.
But it is the worst roadways, the roadways that are either
Bad or unexistent.
unpaved and should be,
Full
or
reconstruction.
have to be completely torn up from the base all the way back to the surface. So if you look at the way this is structured, and they're all structured exactly the same way, down the left-hand side of the page are the years, so 2014, 2015, 16, 17, and 18. Under that are some notations about the type of pavement we're talking about, Also, some additional that as we look forward, you'll see some additional pieces having to do with landscaping, hardscaping, traffic calming, buildings, and park commerce. In the first version of this plan that we're looking at the PCI of 55 or less, plus funding the first 5 years of the park of commerce, which is really $5 million plus a $5 million grant. So that's the $10 million to go for the first 5 years. We've broken this up, if you look across the top of the sheet, into the utilities involved, and then some columns for Park of Commerce in out years, some project management costs, because part of the anticipation here is that staff at the city at the moment do not have the time to properly manage these projects. So the anticipation is that we would hire a project engineer and at least Jamie, one or two, I can't remember now, project manager types under that engineering type.
It was one.
It was one, okay.
And then
So
finance.
it's about $200,000 a year for the management component, and that is reasonable to include in project costs, and it's also reasonable to include in borrowing costs as we go forward. Those folks would not become permanent city employees; they would be hired on contracts. At the time the project was completed, their contract would also complete. So there's no additional ongoing cost to the city. If you look at each one of the first 5 columns there, electric, water, sewer, stormwater, and streets, those are the cost components to do the PCIs under 55 and the Park of Commerce for streets and for water, sewer, and stormwater. It's laid out in each year, and then at the bottom, when you look at the totals, there are 3 levels of totals down there, 4 levels actually of totals down there. The one that says totals in bold print is the total cost of the projects, divided up by those different utilities and totaled across. So in total, that's $80 million worth of work. The $70 million that Felipe and Jamie talked about, plus the $10 million for the Park of Commerce. The second line, the line directly underneath that, has to do with available funding. So fortunately, in the city's utility funds, there are dollars that will be available and are currently available to fund portions of these projects. And if you total that across, you'll see it's $28 million of the total $80 million. We're anticipating a $5 million grant from EDA for the remainder of parts of the Park of Commerce during that period of time. So if you subtract those 2 pieces of those 2 pots of money from the total $80 million, that means that you're borrowing for the base plan and the Park of Commerce would be about $47 million. The idea here is that $47 million would be financed via general obligation bond. And just as a brief background, general obligation bonds are issued by the city. General obligation bonds are issued by the city, but have to be authorized via referendum in a normal election. So the referendum in this case is believed at this point. We're planning on a March referendum to do that. Assuming that it is voted for, then what the citizens are voting on is to tax themselves to pay the debt service on this bond issue for however long it takes to pay it off. In this case, we looked at a 30-year bond in all cases, which is reasonable given the life of projects that we're talking about. Streets, buildings, all those things, the 30-year life is sort of the general standard that is used on that. It also is, when citizens vote on that, it is to tax themselves in addition to any other taxes that the city may levy. So this would be a separate levy that would show on the tax bill. And I think people who have been in the city for some period of time know that there was a general obligation bond to build the police and fire complex back in, I guess, the late '90s, early part of the 2000s. That issue has paid off. It paid off in 2011. So they're familiar, hopefully, with the concept. The millage that it would take to generate the dollars to pay this would vary from year to year, depending on what the total assessed value of the property in the city was. So, for example, as the total assessed value goes up, the number of mills that it takes to generate the flat debt service, because we would be looking at a fixed cost, fixed interest rate bond, so the debt service would remain flat over the period. So in order to raise $2 million worth of debt service, the tax that would go on any individual's property would decline over the period of time as the total assessed value of the city increased. And the next slide kind of shows what that does. So for the base plan on Park of Commerce, initial portion of Park of Commerce, based on assessed values as of 2013 going into 2014, projecting those values to increase at 4% per year, and including some development that we know is going to, or we believe is going to come in the next 3 to 4 years, based on what the William Waters has determined. This is what the millage rate to pay that debt service would look like. Now, obviously, you don't go forward and borrow all the money at the very beginning if it's going to take you 5 years to do a project. It's cheaper to borrow it at least in 2 increments. So that's what this contemplates. And this plan, by the way, is not one that was fully devised in our office. We utilize the city's financial advisor, Public Financial Management, to help us structure how this would work. So the recommendation is that you do 2 different borrowings, one in 2014, where the first payments would not be due until 2015, and the second one in approximately 2018, assuming that you have spent out what you got in 2014. If you don't, then you would delay that until you actually needed the money. Also, by factoring in the money that the city has on hand in the utilities, the $28 million, we can try to minimize our borrowing costs by bringing back those dollars in at appropriate times. All that said, and I won't go into this level of detail with all the 5 alternatives, but I want to kind of cover it to start with. What that says is that our estimate at this point is that it would take about 2 mills of property tax to raise enough to do the base plan for the first 3 years, and that would be dropping from 2 mills on down to about 1.5 mills. And then in the second, at the time of the second borrowing, you would add an increment in order to pay for that. So that's what the salmon colored bar is. I'm not sure what color that is. There's a blue section that constantly goes down. That's your first borrowing, and as I talked about, where the ad valorem, the taxable value increases, the millage rate goes down. The same is true for the incremental portion of the second borrowing. So that ramps up to a little over 2.25 for the base plan. You want to go on to the next? I'm sorry?
It's a remote.
Okay. Wow, okay. So the second version has to do, these are all structured in exactly the same way as the first one. Second version includes the PCI 55 and under, the Parks Commerce 5-year plan, so everything you just saw, plus adds in landscaping, hardscaping, and traffic calming, the pieces that Jamie talked about of the 15 blocks per year of additional work. And these again are hard to see, but it raises the total borrowing cost by about $1 million, a little over $1 million. So that doesn't change your millage estimate hardly at all. Several hundredths of a mil is basically all the difference there. If you go on to version 2, so we have 1A and A, that's the base plan, which we've already looked at. But we are now including PCI of 75 and under. So in the cases where Jamie showed you how many more roads that we could do if we contemplated doing the PCI between 55 and 75, this plan, this financing would include that. It also still includes Park Commerce for the first 5 years, landscaping, hardscaping, traffic calming, and street lighting. So if you think about it, what we're talking about here is sort of like buying a car. You've got the base car with a standard transmission and so on, and then if you add a little bit more to that, then it winds up costing a little bit more over time. So here, the borrowing goes up, and again, these numbers, as you'll see, we've added numbers in the upper columns, which is where the cost of the PCI between 65 and 56 and 65 and 66 and 75 are, the landscaping and the hardscaping. In this, we've also added in some street lighting, some additional street lighting. I don't know, Jenny didn't particularly talk about street lighting, but the concept was that at least in the blocks where we work, where we're doing the work, that additional street lighting at the corners would also occur. So if you have 2 street lights, for example, on the corner. Again, that's something that we can look at as time goes along. The borrowing cost here ramps up a little bit to $56 million. The amounts that are available in all of the utilities remain exactly the same, because those monies will be spent whether you do the base plan or you do these plans that have more in them. So what does that mean? Well, it means that you tax a little bit more. So the first portion of the borrowing goes up to about 2.3, about 2.3, 2.4 mil. The second borrowing, that ramps it up to about 2 3/4 mil. And then as it drops over the 30 years, you can see as it pays out that it continues to drop. Version 3, we've now added in the buildings and property purchase portion that Mike talked about. So this ramps the borrowing up a little bit to $71 million. We add a little bit more money that we have available. If you recall that we have about $1.2 million set aside for public service contracts that has not been spent. Those dollars are still sitting there. So we've added in a little bit more money that the city has available. But we're still needing to borrow about $71 million in order to do this. And that ramps, again, the millage rates up a little bit more. Still slightly under 3 mils for the first borrowing, a little bit under 3.5 for the second. And those go down over the years. Version 4, which is the full-fledged plan, including, in this case, the Park of Commerce in the out years. So if you, there we go. In this case, if you see this column right here, that's the Park of Commerce for the years 2019 through 22, included in this borrowing. So we're looking now at an $80 million borrowing. That ramps the 3.75 in the first year of the second borrowing. So millage rate is sort of an abstract concept, I think, for everybody. So what does it really mean? And James, there's some other paths on there.
On the,
No, not on, yeah.
Do you see what you're seeing?
Okay, yeah, move away with your slideshow. Okay. Go to,
Steve Saturday?
well, no, actually, go to, yeah. We had the property appraiser first off do, to try to give you some measures, and I guess I should have used different color labels on this. Had the property appraiser do a little bit of research for us, and we can try to flesh this out a bit more. But if you look at residential properties in the city of Lake Worth, this big blue portion are properties out of the 11,000 properties, 11,900, something like that, residential properties in the city of Lake Worth. These have a taxable value of $100,000 or less. All those. These have a taxable value between 100 and 200. And taxable value is the assessed value of the property less their homestead, if they have homestead, or whatever other exemptions they may have. Between 200 and 300, it is this little slice here. 300 and 400 is this little slice here. 400 to 500, this little slice here. And the slice that you really can't even see would be those that are basically above 500 million.
Is that on residential?
This is just residential property only. So what that says, obviously enough, is that most people affected by this borrowing or the taxable amount that goes on their property are going to be 86%, 87% of them are in this category, and another 10% here. So 97% of the citizens of Lake Worth will have their millage rate, their borrowing millage rate figured on properties that have an assessed value of $200,000 or less, a taxable value of $200,000 or less. So just to sort of give you an idea, if the value of the property is $100,000 after homestead and so on, the tax at the base plan would be $177 a year. The tax at the version 4 plan with everything